Hello ladies and gents, this is Elijah here to present a quick tutorial on how to constrain a Solidworks model using equations and how to use a design table to define some preset configurations. To demonstrate this techniques, we're going to be modeling a Lego block generator, which will generate a Lego block of an appropriate size given certain specification parameters. So to save time, the basic features of the block have already been extruded. One thing to note is that when you are doing this not only with this part but with any other part, if you're using equations to modify / adjust sizes and dimensions, you must be careful to dimension all of your features, etc., to an appropriate origin or surface so that they adjust appropriately for your needs. For example, in this case we have the interior hollow dimension to always be 1.5 mm offset from all sides, so as the block grows it will always maintain a 1.5 mm thickness as necessary. And then also similarly with both the interior and top stud, they're both dimensioned back to the origin in the lower left corner, as you can see, which just allows, as the block itself grows out in this direction, the initial feature from which the instances are created will always be located appropriately in relation to the corner of the block. So with that in mind, typically with Lego blocks, the number of studs in each direction kind of defines the rest of the size and shape of the block. So we're going to use those as our parameters to define the all the other dimensions within the block. So to begin with, we're just going to model a simple 2x4 Lego block from which we can then add equations to modify all of the related dimensions as those number of instances changes. So to begin with, we're going to start with the top stud. We're going to create a linear pattern. First, in the direction along the side here, we want the spacing to be 8 mm, and we want 4 instances. Similarly, we want to go also in this direction, again with 8 mm spacing, but in this case we want 2 instances. Also being careful to propagate these instances in the same direction away from the origin I mentioned before, so you want to switch the direction on those so you have them spaced appropriately. Similarly, for the interior stud, we also again want to create a linear pattern. In this case, we want to go instead space 3 instances in this direction, but with this current model we don't actually want any instances in the other direction, but we will need them for later, so we do want to tie the direction as well, again being careful to make sure that it goes in the appropriate direction, but in this case we only want 1 instance, which we then can modify later as necessary. So now we have our basic Lego block body with our patterns created. So now we can add the equations to tie everything together. So we want to go into our tools menu, create equations, and we get our equations menu appearing here. So to begin with, we want to define the outer constraints of the body. So we want to highlight the main body and then first get the length. And so this dimension here we want it to tie to the number of instances of the studs on the top. So here we want to then go into that pattern, and we want to, delete this, and then we want to select, it's sometimes difficult to find, but here we have the number 4 for the number of 4 instances in this direction. So once we've selected that, then we can add our equation around that. So we want that to be spaced accordingly. So this will define the length of the block in this direction in which we're interested. Similarly, we then want to go to, in the other direction here, we want to go to the width of the block. Again, we want to tie it to the top studs, but in this case we want to tie it to the number of instances in the other direction, which in this case is 2, which is hiding around here. Whoops. So we tie it to that pattern of 2 instances, and then again, similarly, we want to add the equation as necessary. Alright. And then similarly, we want to vary the number of instances of these interior studs. So we want to bring up that. Again, we want to find here the 3. Oops. So we set the number of instances of that feature in that direction, again, dependent upon the 4 instances in the case of the other studs. In this case, we want 1 less. It's freezing on us. And then we want, again, like I said before, we only have the 1 instance in the one direction, but we want to expand that now. So again, we want to go and tie this instance to the opposite side pattern. In this case 2, again, but we want 1 less. So now we've created all the equations we need to have the block adjust itself based on the number of instances. So for example, if we were to go and modify this and add, say, an instance in each direction, it would grow the entirety of the block and add the appropriate number of internal studs. This is kind of a haphazard way of doing it. Another way that you could define these values is here in the equations menu. You can define some global variables, which are much easier to change and set, and it can adjust accordingly. But in this case, we want to use a design table and configurations, which additionally allows us to create multiple different part shapes from the same part file without having to actually go in and edit the part. So we're going to do that. We're going to go up here to the menu, insert a table, and we want to insert a design table. Keep the standard settings. And so now it's going to generate a design table, and it's going to ask us which dimensions we want to include in the new design table. So in this case, we want dimension 1 and dimension 2, just remembering from before, from the first linear pattern. So we want to include those, and there you can see our 3 and 5 instances now that we have in that we had created before. So now we want to go back and create the 2x4 instance, and then perhaps a 2x8 and a 5x5. And then here we can just add the appropriate dimensions that we want to carry forward. And it will construct the configurations that we want accordingly. You can also, if you have other dimensions that you want to include, you can add them in that section simply by highlighting the cell and then clicking on it, and it will include that, so you can modify whatever you want, including the material. But for our case, we just want to change the number of instances of studs. Once you've done that, you just click outside of the box, and it tells you that it's generated the following configurations for you, all of the ones that you wanted. So you can click OK, and now here you can pan through your various configurations that you've created, and it has them all pre-generated. And so the advantage of this now is when you go and you create, say, an assembly, now you can, if you have multiple variations of similar parts, you can go in and you can, using one part file, you can create multiple similar parts simply by coming in and then configuring the component and setting it to the configuration which you desire. And so now you can see that you can have multiple different variations of similar parts, but all from the same part file, which reduces the demand on both your hardware as well as on your efforts for having to create separate files. And that pretty much covers everything we need to cover today. Hopefully this is helpful. Thanks for your time, and thanks for watching.